Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. And today's topic is the second part of our lecture on problems in the early republic. Now, as always, take a moment, hit pause on your video, jot down the rest of the lecture outline, and pay particular attention to those key terms at the top. Now, with that, let's get started. Now, we left off with these problems going on in the early republic, specifically in the Washington administration. So we've settled the problem of our Constitution, but the question still remains, do we want a big government with loose interpretation of the Constitution or a smaller government with a more strict interpretation? And at least in the short term, Alexander Hamilton, big government, expansive government, loose interpretation wins out. What we're going to see is Hamilton begins to implement his policies, including the idea of, well, combine all of our debt. And so let's pick up right there. So how do you pay for this debt now? Of course, the answer is tax. Impose taxes on the American people. And starting in 1789, 1790, Hamilton began to implement a series of taxes that became popularly known as the whiskey tax. Why? It's a tax on distilled spirits. It was proposed in December of 1790 and would go into effect in March of 1791. There was immediate widespread protest across the United States, especially Pennsylvania. Why? Well, Pennsylvania was a large corn-growing region, and these corn farmers are especially upset by the whiskey tax. Why? Well, let's put it this way for a minute. Corn is a great crop. It's great to eat, not bad nutrition. The problem with corn is if you're a mass producer of it in the 1790s, it is very expensive and very difficult to get to market, especially if you're in rural Pennsylvania. So often happens because we don't have trains or automobiles. We don't have roads yet. And so what we find is often the corn spoils, molds, etc., before they actually can sell it, much of it goes to waste. But what if you ferment that corn and turn it into whiskey? Whiskey doesn't spoil. In fact, whiskey just gets better with age. And it's far more lucrative. By the way, this begins a series in my lectures where we'll probably mention alcohol at least once in every lecture. It's a big part of early America. So whiskey is great for two reasons. It's easy to produce with corn. You produce lots of corn. Doesn't spoil, gets better with age. And you make more money off it. So fantastic. But now there's a tax on it. And so Alexander Hamilton's whiskey tax is going to hurt these farmers the most. Again, common people. People that Hamilton doesn't like, but who Jefferson loves. And so these farmers in Pennsylvania are especially irritated by this tax. And in Western Pennsylvania, this frustration just grows and grows to a boiling point. Now remember, it went into effect in March of 1791. And so come the new year, 1792, tax season comes around, no taxes. 1793, no taxes. 1794, still no taxes. These farmers just flat out refuse to pay the tax. Sound familiar? All the different taxes that Britain tried to pass? These farmers are doing a very similar process. And so in July of 1794, after 3 years of no taxes, I mean, come on, Hamilton's trying to pay for this new government, trying to pay off our debt, make America great. These farmers aren't getting on board. And so in July of 1794, Hamilton sends in federal marshals. And he tells the federal marshal to go to Western Pennsylvania, take a dozen troops with you, just to make sure, and basically force these farmers to pay their tax. So the federal marshal and 12 soldiers get to Western Pennsylvania. They confront these farmers, and there's a small fist fight and a few shots fired. Ultimately, in the end, the federal marshal and these troops, these dozen troops, surrender. And so having the federal marshal surrender with some troops now turned this kind of small scale rebellion into full scale rebellion. And now the question is, if you're Hamilton, what do you do with this thing we now call the Whiskey Rebellion? So the federal marshal goes back to Washington, or go back to George Washington and Hamilton, and Hamilton says, "Wait, no, hang on, Washington, you can't let these drunk farmers with pitchforks do this to you. We need those taxes. You can't let these farmers do whatever they want." And so Hamilton persuades Washington to send out another group of soldiers to, well, enforce the law of the taxes, and collect taxes from these farmers. So in July of 1794, we sent a dozen troops. How many do you think Hamilton should send this time? 2 dozen? 50? 100? 500? No, no. Alexander Hamilton and George Washington sent 13,000 U.S. troops to Western Pennsylvania to squash the Whiskey Rebellion and basically force farmers to pay a tax. Wait, wasn't there this fear about, I don't know, the federal government using their power and military against the common person? Wasn't that one of our big revolutionary value things that Jefferson feared? Why the Second Amendment exists? Yeah, this reason right here. Not only are they sending 13,000 troops, George Washington himself, General Washington, the first president of the United States, is going to lead the men to Western Pennsylvania. Well, they started getting about halfway there, and Hamilton says, wait. It'd be really bad if a stray bullet from a drunk farmer shot and accidentally killed our first president. That'd be bad. He's the first president. Hey, George, why don't you just go home? Go back to the Capitol. And George says, you know what? I think you're right. So George turns around and goes home. So who do you put in charge now of 13,000 troops? Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton gets the power he craves. And Hamilton's now in charge. So Hamilton goes into town. He goes up to the first farmer, starts shaking him down. Where's my taxes? First farmer's like, taxes? What taxes? The whiskey tax. Farmer's like, wait, you didn't get my taxes? I sent them. The check was in the mail. In fact, if you didn't get your taxes, you shouldn't be talking to me. In fact, talk to the post office. Isn't the post office under the federal government jurisdiction? You're the one in charge of the post office. So if you didn't get my check with them. Hamilton's irate, goes to the next farmer. Where's my taxes? Farmer says, wait, I paid my taxes. Check was in the mail. Third farmer, same story. In fact, Hamilton and the 13,000 troops couldn't find a single farmer who would admit to not paying their taxes or to be part of this quote-unquote whiskey rebellion. Now, big surprise, there's 13,000 federal troops. You're not going to admit to not paying your taxes here. Now, Hamilton does not want to go home empty-handed, so he does arrest 20 men and charges them with treason. Again, not paying the taxes. He takes the 20 so-called rebels back. And Washington says, Hamilton, seriously, no. And Washington pardons all 20 individuals. And of course, this whole use of the federal army against the American citizens was viewed very badly by the American public. Hamilton believed there was widespread rebellion in Western Pennsylvania. In reality, It was just some people that felt their voice was being trampled by the federal government and they wanted their voice to be heard. Yes, maybe they went about it the wrong way, but there's no Twitter back then to fire back at people. Now, in the aftermath of the Whiskey Rebellion, Hamilton looks like a fool. He looked like an incredibly power-hungry, egotistical maniac. And he was quick to abuse power, exactly what Jefferson had charged him. In addition, he used his influence to make Washington look bad. And so the Whiskey Rebellion makes this new government look really, really bad. And then things get worse because while we're facing these serious domestic issues, Washington and his administration are also facing some growing international problems. Because in the 1790s, there's renewed European warfare brought about by the French Revolution. Now, the French Revolution is ultimately going to embroil Europe in warfare, especially once Napoleon becomes emperor. But the Americans, especially Washington, want to stay out of this. Remember, we don't want to get embroiled in international affairs. The problem is, even though they want to stay out of it, people are quick to pick sides. Some people support France. Some people support the British. And two reasons here. On the one hand, people support France because they feel like, hey, these guys are kind of the inheritors of the American Revolution. And on the one hand, this makes sense. On the other hand, many say, no. They're killing people in the streets in France. They're beheading fools. And thus, many turn to Britain for also logical reasons. One is, maybe France is taking it too far. Maybe this is what Hamilton means when you give too much power to the common man. And between that and strong financial ties to Great Britain, again, economic reasons. But in either case, the European warfare divides the United States. So on the heels of the Whiskey Rebellion, and in accordance with this growing tension in Europe, Washington sets a precedent in 1796 that he does not want to be president again. And he sets up this precedent that a president will only serve 2 terms. Again, this was not in the original Constitution. It's not in the Constitution until after 1945. So in 1796, Washington steps down, and we will have our first real competition for the presidency. And the door opens for this new competition. Remember, Washington was kind of like everyone's pick. No big deal. Everyone agreed, good pick. But in 1796, during the course of Washington's presidency, 2 political parties formed. And since he's not running again, it opens it up to competition. And so, in 1796, we will have the Federalist Party, and we will have the Democratic Republican Party. And in the election of 1796, we will have 4 men running for the presidency. Federalists will include John Adams, who was the vice president under Washington, and Thomas Pinckney. And they will go against former Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson and, of course, Aaron Burr. Now, of course, these Federalists, they want a more powerful, robust federal government, continue the expansion that we saw under Washington and Hamilton, versus Thomas Jefferson, the Democratic Republicans. Again, note the new name, not the Anti-Federalists, because that sounds bad. And they believe in a smaller, weaker federal government, and generally they support the French in the French Revolution. Now remember, this is not a general election. This is not a popular vote of the American people. Rather, it's just the Electoral College, and in the end, it comes down to 2 men, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. And John Adams wins by a count of 71 to 68. It's a very close race. Now, in early elections, what's interesting is the president did not get to pick a running mate to be vice president. Rather, the first runner-up, or the loser, of the electoral election became the vice president. So in this case, Adams becomes president, but his vice president is Thomas Jefferson, meaning you have a Federalist for president and an anti-Federalist, i.e. Democratic Republican, as vice president. Can you imagine if Hillary Clinton was now the vice president to Donald Trump, or vice versa for that matter? And so this really begins to make Adams paranoid. Adams believes that the Federalist Party's losing power. If you think about it, there's good reason for that. Thanks to Hamilton and other issues, but the big one, Hamilton, the Whiskey Rebellion, it's put a strain in distrust of the American people in the Federalist Party. And so the Federalist Party under Adams begins passing some legislation that will target political opposition. And so if you begin to protest this government, you might find yourself in a lot of trouble. And he passes a couple of acts in particular in 1798, known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. Now, technically there's three separate acts here. There's the Alien Enemies Law, there's the Naturalization Act, and the Sedition Act. Now, historically speaking, we combine these into what's called the Alien and Sedition Acts. So what do these acts actually do? Well, the Alien Enemies Law is actually very important in our history. It says the president can detain or deport citizens of countries with which the U.S. was at war. Now, on the one hand, this makes a little sense. Like, if you're a citizen of, well, say, France, and we're at war with France, you don't want a potential traitor being in our country. So it made some sense on the one hand. But the way this is going to be applied, historically speaking, this is the basis of how we're allowed to intern Japanese Americans during World War II. No, these were Japanese Americans. These were U.S. citizens, which does not technically what the law says, but we were arguing that they were still maintaining loyalty to a foreign country. Then there's the Naturalization Act, which lengthened the wait time for foreigners to apply for citizenship from 5 to 14 years. So in 1798, prior to this act, if you were a foreign national and you want to become a U.S. citizen, you must be a resident of the United States for 5 years. After this act, you had to wait 14 years to apply for citizenship. Why? Because generally speaking, Adams believed, he was correct statistically, that these new immigrants tended to support the Democratic Republican Party and Thomas Jefferson. So this is very politically motivated. And then the third one, the Sedition Act, it criminalized criticism of the government and the president, which of course strikes at the heart of the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment rights of freedom of speech. Think about this. This is huge. This is exactly targeting. This is not just targeting the Alien Enemies Act, the Naturalization Act. These are targeting immigrants, right? They're targeting non-U.S. The Sedition Act is targeting U.S. citizens who are protected under the Bill of Rights. And this is a very important act. Also, not only is it going to be a demise for John Adams, it's going to come back into play, though, in World War I. We're going to reapply this, and we're actually going to put people in jail for 20 years for criticizing the government or criticizing World War I. And so this could be print, it could be oral. Either way, this contradicts the First Amendment and it violates the Constitution. Isn't this exactly what Jefferson warned of? What Jefferson feared? What he actually said was, yep, this is a major problem. So how does Jefferson respond? Remember, Jefferson is vice president here. So how does he respond to this? Well, Jefferson responded by helping to pen what's called the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, or the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. And what these resolutions argue, that again, they're written by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. They argue that if the federal government passes legislation that a state deems as unconstitutional. The state does not have to enforce it, they can ignore it. Let me repeat that. The Kentucky and Virginia resolutions argue that if the federal government passes a law that a state feels is unconstitutional, the state can either ignore it or not enforce it. Now, of course, this is problematic for some reasons, because again, it can create what you would think is anarchy. On the other hand, though, this is incredibly important in our history. It still plays out today. Now, it's not called the same thing. We'll talk about multiple times this happens in our history. We'll talk about it in the 1820s. We'll talk about it again in the 1850s and 60s. We'll talk about it in 1870s. We'll talk not in this class. We talk about it today, though, with the idea of sanctuary cities. We still talk about the same issue today. Do states have a right to always follow the letter of federal law, or do states have some autonomy? Of course, ultimately then, who decides the constitutionality of the law? Well, we know now Supreme Court does, but back in the 1790s, it was still a little up for debate because remember, this was a brand new thing, Supreme Court. And so Jefferson and Madison are arguing here that states can decide constitutionality, not Supreme Court. So basically, because Virginia refuses to enforce this law, Thomas Jefferson, who criticizes John Adams and the government, nothing happens to him, even despite him being vice president. But this crisis in 1798 of the Alien Sedition Acts, this creates a crisis of American democracy. And in the midst of this crisis in 1800, we have a new election. It's a rematch, John Adams against Thomas Jefferson. And once again, there will be another Pinckney, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, and of course, Aaron Burr. Now, of course, Aaron Burr's out of the state of New York, and he's a Democratic Republican like Jefferson. Now, in this election, again, it's electoral college only voting, you see the results here. Adams, the incumbent, received 65 electoral votes. Jefferson received 73, Aaron Burr received 73, so it's a tie. But, first and foremost, who's the big loser here? The Federalist Party. The Federalist Party that had been in power for 12 years here, under Washington and Adams. And of course, Hamilton's hand was in this too. The Federalist Party is the big losers here. The big winners here, of course, are the Democrats and Republicans. But the question now is, who wins? Who becomes president? So the question for you then is, in the event of a tie, who decides the election? Well, Congress does, specifically the House of Representatives. And so the House will decide this election, and they will get to vote on who they want to be president. Guys, the House of Representatives cast their votes. The votes came in, it was still a tie. It took 36 ballots, 36 rounds of voting to finally declare Thomas Jefferson the winner. And of course, vice president will be Aaron Burr, because he's the first loser. But when Jefferson becomes president, again, the big loser here was the Federalist Party, this idea of big government, the Federalist influence. Now, it's not going to go away, obviously, they'll still be around. But they are the big losers in this election. And we call the election of 1800, it's known as the Revolution of 1800. Why? Well, for the first time in our nation's history, political power was transferred from one party to the opposing political party. Now, this happens all the time now, right? I mean, just go back in recent history. In 1992, Bill Clinton became president, took over from the Republican George H.W. Bush. Democrat Bill Clinton becomes president, and in 2000, Republican George W. Bush becomes president. In 2008, Democrat Barack Obama is elected. And of course, in 2016, Republican Donald Trump is elected. So we see this, it happens all the time. And even in disputed elections like 2000, when it was a very close race, there was still, it went all the way to the Supreme Court, the case of Gore v. Bush. It was still a peaceful transition, but back in 1800, we had never done it before. Would there be riots? Would there be uproar? Would there be a revolution or a civil war? And the reality is, no, it was peaceful. This was a test of American democracy. There was a crisis of American democracy in 1798 with the Illinois Sedition Acts. There was a crisis of the American democracy when it came to the Whiskey Rebellion. But 1800 changed everything. Again, I'm not saying I support Democratic Republicans versus Federalists. It's not about that. America changed political parties, political ideologies, and as a president, it never missed a beat. And that is impressive by however you look at things. We went from the Federalist Party, who believes in big government, to the Jeffersonian Party of Democratic Republicans, who believe in small government. We went from a Federalist Party that favored the wealthy and the elite, remember Hamilton, to a government Democratic Republicans political party that believed in the common people. Jefferson believed in the common person. He wanted power at the state level, power at the individual rights. And the thing is, what Jefferson was most concerned with, especially compared to like Alexander Hamilton, Jefferson was concerned with the common person. As far as he was concerned, the backbone of our country, in other words, to borrow a recent quote, to make America great, you need to rely on the farmers of America. Jefferson believed that farmers were preferable to those who worked in finance, because he argued that, see, farmers work with their hands, and they produce crops and food that go to feed other people, which means by nature they are fairly unselfish, according to Jefferson, versus wealthy capitalists or bankers whose priority is not feeding or helping the mass, but rather lining their own pocketbooks. And so, whereas the Federalists placed their faith in the wealthy and the bankers who basically wanted more money for themselves, the Democratic Republicans under Jefferson believe in the common person. Jefferson believes that in order for a country to be successful, to be great, you need broad-based liberty and economic opportunity. Now, please don't hear me wrong here. He's no saint. And while there is some discussion over why he owned slaves, the fact is he was still a slave owner. He was not advocating for women's rights here. He was talking about white men only. But nonetheless, the Revolution of 1800 is important. Not only do we transfer power, but we set the stage for what becomes known as Jeffersonian America that will dominate politics for the next 24 years. And again, this is important because for a long period of time now, we will talk about the Jeffersonian vision, the Jeffersonian idea of the small yeoman farmer. And we will see some contradictions. We will see some, limitations to this vision. But those are all questions for a future date. So for now, we'll stop here. We'll pick up next time with, Jefferson and his presidency. But until next time, bye-bye.